Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome. Looks like we have a small group today. That is what it is, but we'll make the most of our time and continue. This is somewhat of a continuation of the talk that I gave a few months ago on Sunday morning on sort of essentially great figures in American Jewish history. And there are so many of them. And many people commented after the lecture that there was a desire for more learning. And I appreciate that. And I think that this is something that could be an ongoing class. I think it's something we're all interested in. Not only because as American Jews, this is part of our history, but this is also more broadly part of American history. There's just been so many interesting Jewish figures in American life. There's interesting Jewish figures in world history. If you think about it, somebody once pointed this out, that the entire world Jewish population would be considered a small statistical error in a Chinese census. In a census of China, our entire global population would be a small error. And yet, we have an outside impact on the world. You've all heard the statistics about Nobel Prizes and all, we know that. We know that Jews have had a tremendous impact. And so these are great stories. And I tried to pick people, some of whom you've undoubtedly heard of, but also some that maybe you haven't heard of, or at least maybe heard the name, but don't know the full history of it. And my usual style is just to talk, but I thought it would be more fun to actually do some slides and to talk over these slides. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, Stacy, can you enable screen sharing? Let's see. I think you can make me co-host or something.
Should be ready.
Okay, let's see here. Yes, there we go. Okay, let me open up my slides. Okay. Go, influential American Jews. Okay. Let's see.
We're all challenged these days by technology, aren't we?
No question. It's always. Oh, can you see it now? Okay, good. Okay. So there really isn't a rhyme or reason. I tried to kind of keep things, somewhat chronological order, but we're going to jump around a lot. So their first person, has anyone heard of this man, David Yulee Levy? Anybody? Yes? Okay, who was he? Yeah? Okay, no, anybody? Okay, so as I say here, he is the first Jewish senator in the United States. Isn't that interesting? He was a senator from the state of Florida. Soon after Florida became a state in the Union, it went from Florida territory, and he was their senator. He was Jewish essentially by birth. He was not practicing, and even though his father was an ardent Jew, but he lived an incredibly interesting life. So let's learn about him. So he's born in St. Thomas. There was as you probably know from the story of Alexander Hamilton, people think Hamilton might well have been Jewish. Certainly, there was a large Sephardic Jewish population in the West Indies on those islands, and David Levy was born there. His father was a very successful timber. He was a timber importer, exporter, essentially. And he had immigrated to the West Indies from Morocco. Morocco had a large Jewish population. It's another fascinating history. And after David Levy's father achieved great success, he wanted to build a utopian new Zion. Like this is just, we don't learn about this kind of history. He had a vision of a a land of freedom and prosperity for Jews from around the world. And he said, I want to build it in Florida. And this is in the 1820s and 1830s. And he chose the area kind of near where Jacksonville is today, sort of St. Augustine, that sort of northeast Florida, beautiful area. The weather isn't always great, but it's a beautiful area. And so in the I think it was the 1820s, David Levy's father moved the whole family to Florida. His project failed because of the Seminole Wars, the wars with the Seminole Native Americans who lived in Florida. And so the project kind of fell apart. But David Levy was an ambitious guy. And through his father's connections and so forth, he became a political figure. And he was very involved. He was a legislator in the Florida territory. And he was a very early participant in railroads, in building railroads. And if you know your history about America, the railroad industry was very corrupt and relied on government money. And David Levy was a master at procuring government contracts to build railroads. So he became very successful, and he built the first railroad that went from one side of Florida to the other side of Florida. And when Florida became a U.S. state in 1845, he was one of their senators, one of the first 2 senators from Florida. And of course, he was he was the first Jewish senator. And he married, this is a mistake. He married the daughter of the Kentucky governor. And then he was an odd, he agreed to raise his children Christian, but he changed his last name to Yulee, not because that was his wife's last name, but because that was his original family name before Levy. Who knows why he does that? He has the official Florida state legislature grant his name change. It's odd, but this is what. But with a name like David Levy, he experienced anti-Semitism. He was a major target of anti-Semitism, and he never renounced Judaism. This is very much kind of like Judah Benjamin and kind of like Benjamin Disraeli in England. These were figures with very recognizable Jewish names who didn't practice Judaism at all, but who were targets of anti-Semitism and never renounced their Judaism. I think that is something to appreciate. It would have been many people at the time. We don't talk about this history very much, but many people essentially officially renounced their Judaism and became bad. I mean, Heinrich Heine, the German poet, is a famous example. There are many people who essentially, left Judaism altogether. David Levy did not leave Judaism. He just didn't practice it. So he built Florida railroads. He experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, he was an ardent secessionist. He helped lead the walkout of Southern senators from the U.S. Senate in 1861 on the eve of the Civil War. And he had a lot of slaves. He had a large plantation in Florida, and he was an ardent. He was actually imprisoned after the Civil War. He was thrown in jail for 8 months, and he lost tremendous amount of money. He lost his plantations and so forth. So he suffered tremendously, but he eventually, after he left prison, he was able to get back into the railroad business. And when he died, he was the president of a railroad company. And he actually died in Washington, D.C. shortly after his wife died. And if you've ever been, how many of you ever been to Amelia Island, Florida, Fernandina Beach? If you've ever been there, it's a very interesting place to visit. There is a sculpture. There is a statue of a monument to David Levy Yulee. And it's the only known statue of a Jewish Confederate leader. I've seen it. I've been there. It's fascinating. That's how I originally learned about him. I had no idea who he was until we were on vacation there about 5 years ago. And I saw this. And so it is a fascinating story. There's not much, he didn't really leave any papers. He was not really very well liked, unfortunately. He was sort of a ruthless railroad kind of businessman. And so he didn't have many admirers. People admired Judah Benjamin for a variety of reasons. He's one of the people we talked about a few months ago. But David Levy did not consume that. He didn't evoke that same sort of admiration. He was seen more as a kind of a businessman and a firebrand than a true leader, kind of like Judah Benjamin was. Any questions? Interesting story, huh? So, but he holds that distinction, first Jewish senator. Okay. Our next person, also Sephardic Jewish. Now, this is so interesting because 90% of American Jews today are Ashkenazic. Now, what's the you probably know, Ashkenazic Jews trace their lineage to Europe, Eastern, Western, Central Europe, all Europe, whereas Sephardic Jews trace their ancestry to North Africa and the Middle East. And Spain, really. I mean, Spain sort of is Sfarad. So the earliest American Jewish settlers were Sephardic because they were sort of global traders. But again, today, most American Jews are Ashkenazic, but the very earliest were Sephardic. Emma Lazarus, who of course you know from the famous poem on the Statue of Liberty, "Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me, I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Beautiful poet. She was from a long-time Sephardic Jewish family in New York. In fact, her family goes back to the first group of Jews that landed in New Amsterdam, modern-day New York, in 1653. That was her family going back. These were Jews from Brazil, who originally were from Portugal. And before she became famous for her poem, The New Colossus, she was a very highly regarded poet and writer. She translated great poets from German to English. She actually wrote the first compilation of American Jewish poetry in 1882. And the poem, the book was called Voice of a Semite. That was the title. And what's so interesting in many ways about Emma Lazarus is she, even though she was from a nominally Orthodox family, all the Sephardic Jews are nominally Orthodox. Most of them were not observant. Has anyone ever been to the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in New York City? Okay, next time you're in New York, you have to go. Just take a tour. Just trust me, you will be blown away. It is a unbelievably beautiful sanctuary, and it's one of the oldest operating congregations in America. And so her family was part of that, but she did not grow up with much Judaism practice in the home. Very similar to German Jewish assimilated immigrants. But when Jews started coming in from Eastern Europe in 1881, that created a sense of consciousness and commitment. She was inspired by their stories. And so she became more interested in her Jewish background. And that's when she began writing Jewish-themed poetry. And she was very successful. She was really a very noted, appreciated writer. Okay, let's see here. Oh, well, we're not done with her yet. So she writes this poem that is eventually, she wins this contest for the poem to be placed on the Statue of Liberty, and that achieves great renown. But interestingly, one of the interesting things about Emma Lazarus, and people continue to study her today, she never married. There is a lot of speculation that she was an early lesbian. There's a whole theme. I read her biography. There's a whole chapter about this because she had very sort of not typical love letters, but very intimate letters with her and another Jewish woman from her sort of social circle. So it's an interesting story. But clearly, just because of the Statue of Liberty, she's one of the most remembered American Jewish figures from that time. Any questions about Emma Lazarus? Fascinating stuff. Okay, the next person I bet you have never heard of. And it's a shame because she is so interesting. Ray Frank. Anybody heard of Ray Frank?
No.
Okay. Ray Frank is largely considered the first female rabbi in America, but she wasn't an official rabbi. So why would I say that? Well, she essentially is the first woman known to perform all the rabbinical duties associated with American rabbi. And she did this in the late 1800s. So who was she? She was born in San Francisco, so way out west. And again, a lot of things happen in the West that don't really, that foreshadow what's going to happen in other parts of the country. She's born in the San Francisco area. She ultimately, she moves around. They live in Lake Tahoe for a while. And then ultimately she ends up living in Oakland. And she is a teacher at a Sunday school at a Reform synagogue in Oakland. And people are so impressed by her speaking ability. She's such a good teacher and such a good speaker that she starts going on speaking tours, visiting synagogues. And she happens to be on a speaking tour in Spokane, Washington, near the High Holy Days in, I believe did I put the year on here? It's somewhere around 1872 or so. I guess I did I put the year on? Okay, I didn't put the year. I think it's 1872. She's on a speaking tour, and she realizes she's incredibly sad that the Reform and Orthodox communities in Spokane, Washington hate each other so much that they can't even get together for the High Holy Days so that they can have a real service. They're such a small community, but they can't get together. So she chastises them for that. And she's so inspiring that they say, we'll get together if you speak to our community. So essentially, she leads High Holy Day services in about the 1872 in Spokane, Washington. And not only does she lead the services, she gives the sermon. Now, what's interesting is she doesn't give the sermon during the service. She waits till after the service concludes to give the sermon, which is not usual, but that is maybe in some ways a concession to the radicalness of what she's doing. But she gives a sermon and it produces headlines all over the world. The headlines say the girl rabbi of the Golden West. And so she becomes this sort of phenom, and she starts speaking in synagogues really across the West. And eventually she starts taking classes at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and then by correspondence. And there are several rabbis in the 1890s who say she should be ordained as a rabbi, including one of the most famous rabbis in America, Emil Hirsch, who's in Chicago, grandfather of Edward, first Jewish Attorney General. We'll have to do a session on him. So anyways, there are a lot of people who say she should be ordained a rabbi, but she actually doesn't want to. She doesn't want to. Isaac Mayer Wise is thrilled. He says, he's the president of Hebrew Union College. And he says, we glory in her zeal and moral courage to break down the last remains of the barriers erected in the synagogue against women. In the laws governing the Hebrew Union College, the question of sex or race or confession is not touched upon at all. We can only encourage Miss Ray Frank or any other gifted lady who takes the theological courses to assist the cause of emancipating women in the synagogue and the congregation. Yeah, remarkable, remarkable. Ultimately, though, what happens is she kind of, fades out. It doesn't really continue. And she ends up moving to Berkeley, California with her husband, who is a professor. And then, funny enough, she ends up at the University of Illinois. The National Council of Jewish Women has its first meeting in 1893 at the World's Fair, which is held in Chicago. She's their spiritual leader. And even at that time, several Christian denominations have already started ordaining women. So this was a major possibility that she could have been the first female rabbi if the Jewish community had really rallied together. But what's very interesting about her, in addition, is while she is this radical figure, in a sense, as serving as a rabbinical role, she didn't support women voting. That's very interesting. It's a very interesting contradiction. She's a radical on one hand and conservative on the other. And one scholar I read about her wrote this: while Frank's independence of action might seem incompatible with some of her traditional ideas, in fact, the combination was not unusual in her day. Caught between Victorian conceptions of women's spheres and new ideas about women's roles circulating in American society, the late 19th century saw many people freely mixing progressive and conservative opinions. So this was a very fluid time. This was a time when all these new ideas were coming out, and it was a lot for some people. So someone like Ray Frank was radical in some areas and conservative in others. This was an example. So what eventually happens is she settles with her husband, first in Berkeley and then in University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And she's a writer. She's a newspaper writer. She writes articles and so forth. And she doesn't really ever take up this Jewish mantle of being a rabbi again. She does help start the entire Hillel movement. You know, Hillel, one of the first Hillels in the United States, is at University of Illinois, which she helped start. But it's sort of this forgotten story of the first female rabbi in America. Well, not officially, but unofficially. Questions about her? Ray Frank. It's a great story. Yeah, Sue.
I find it very interesting that that as educated as this woman is, and as active as she is in so many areas, and yet she isn't for women voting, you would think she would want her voice heard. Yeah. It's puzzling to me.
Very, very puzzling. I think, it's hard to put ourselves in the shoes of people living in that time. To us, it seems, of course, obviously women should vote. But, sometimes people can be ahead of their times in one area of life and behind the times in another, know? And I think that was sort of where she was. I have no doubt that she probably changed, I couldn't find anything about it, but I'm sure she changed her mind over time. But sort of at that pivotal moment, she was sort of on the more conservative side. Yeah. Very interesting. But it just shows,
I don't want to take up your time. I'll just very quickly say I have a very deep feeling in my heart about the University of Illinois Hillel. As you know, Rabbi, Dick and I both went to school in Champaign-Urbana, and the first place he ever kissed me was in the parking lot of Hillel after Purim Carnival.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I have a very deep feeling about that place.
Well, it's a great Hillel. It's one of the very first, and it's very special. Yeah, I mean, Hillel was a very important development in American Jewish life, because what tended to happen before Hillel is many kids would go to college and they would essentially leave Judaism because they associated Judaism with, old-fashioned, anti-scientific, anti-progressive ways of thinking. And that was what university, was meant to counter. But then Hillel gave students a Jewish place at university, and it was very, very important. Still is today.
Yes.
Okay, so that's Ray Frank. Very interesting. Okay. This is a very interesting figure. Louis Marshall, another person. So we have a member of the synagogue. Some of you probably know her. I should have told her we were going to have Gail Goldstein. So Gail Goldstein's daughter is married to the great-grandson of Louis Marshall. And I believe it's the last name yeah, it's still the last name Marshall. So it goes through. It's his son, grandson, and then this is a great grandson. So Lewis Marshall, fascinating individual. He was born in Syracuse, and he became a very successful attorney in New York City. Very kind of like a Louis Brandeis level of success. Very respected, politically active, a Republican. He was a Republican, whereas Brandeis was a Democrat. So in some ways, he was part of this very successful group of German Jews. If you've ever read the book Our Crowd, probably you heard the book Our Crowd. He was of that ilk, although he wasn't a banker. He was an attorney, but he was part of that sort of class of Jews who were associated with Temple Emmanuel in New York. But he was more Jewish than many of, in a sense, more Jewish. But he was more actively Jewish. He was president of Temple Emmanuel for like decades. Back in those days, someone was the president of the synagogue for 20, 30 years. They would just stay the president. That doesn't happen much anymore, but it did happen back then. And he was that figure. And what's so fascinating about him is he was somebody who, whereas most Jews of his sort of ilk assimilated, he was actively Jewish, and he helped found many of the American Jewish organizations that exist today. The American Jewish Committee, he was one of the very first founders of it. The Jewish Theological Seminary, which was the seminary for the conservative movement, he, as a German Reformed Jew, helped start the Jewish Theological Seminary because he believed that all these Jews from Eastern Europe, they weren't going to become Reform, but they couldn't stay Orthodox. So there needed to be a middle ground that was traditional, but also American. I mean, how insightful. So he was the first chairman of the board of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and they have a Lewis Marshall Award at the Jewish Theological Seminary in his honor. If you've heard the story of Leo Frank, who was the Jew in Atlanta, who was lynched and blamed for a murder in 1913, he was his attorney. He was hired by the Frank family in Atlanta. He lost that case, but he was respected and admired. He was one of the founders of the NAACP and the ACLU, and he was this real tremendous presence in organized Jewish life, sort of a behind the scenes, benefactor and strategist. And what's so interesting is he was often, if you look historically, he was in many ways the opposite of Louis Brandeis. Both were very successful lawyers, but Marshall was a Republican, Brandeis is a Democrat. Marshall is a Jewish insider. He is a president of a synagogue. He is a devout. He attends services. He's proudly Jewish. Brandeis is an outsider. Brandeis probably never stepped foot in a synagogue until he had to give speeches about Zionism. He was not an active member of the Jewish community. If you've heard of the Triangle Shirt Fire, the garment workers, in New York, the garment factories were owned by German Jews, and their workers were often Eastern European Jews. And there were strikes. And Lewis Marshall would represent the factory owners, whereas Louis Brandeis would represent the workers. And they came to agreements. I mean, this was a good thing. The fact that they were both, they shared this religious background was actually a help. But they played different roles in the American Jewish constellation. Lewis Marshall was a non-Zionist. He wasn't an anti-Zionist. He didn't oppose Israel, but he didn't believe there should be a Jewish state. He believed that there should be Jewish culture flourishing in Israel, whereas Louis Brandeis was a very prominent Zionist. So they were very sort of almost two sides of the coin of American Jewish leadership. And there were many people, when Woodrow Wilson appointed Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court, there were people that were shocked. They expected Louis Marshall to be the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. But Woodrow Wilson was very close with Brandeis and chose Brandeis. But in the larger sort of story of American Jewish history, Lewis Marshall may well have been the more influential person. The American Jewish Committee still exists; it's very strong. The kind of philanthropy that Lewis Marshall championed and the institutions he created are still. I mean, the Jewish Theological Seminary is still functioning, very strong. So he was a very influential, important figure. He was also a very early conservationist. Now, the reason I know so much about Lewis Marshall is I wrote when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, I wrote my honors thesis on Louis Brandeis and the American Zionist movement. So while researching Brandeis, I, of course, did a lot of research on Marshall. And there are many volumes of his letters. And I read them. And first of all, the man was brilliant, but he was a very early supporter of national parks, of wildlife and ecology, and just a fascinating figure. He argued many cases before the Supreme Court, successfully, most of them. And he was sort of he symbolized a lot of what was good about American Jewish life. Questions about Lewis Marshall? Okay. This man was almost an antagonist to Lewis Marshall. So how many of you have heard of Rabbi Stephen Wise? Probably some of you have heard that he was a pretty famous rabbi. So Stephen Wise was born in Hungary, immigrated to America with his parents when he was 8, I believe, to New York City. His father was a rabbi and his grandfather. So it was a rabbinical family. But Wise grows up mainly in New York City, and he studies to become a rabbi. And he's ultimately ordained in Germany. This was before there was really a Hebrew Union College. So most early Reform rabbis were kind of privately ordained, or they would go and study in Germany and be ordained there. So he's ordained and he comes back, and his first pulpit job is in Portland, which is very far from New York City. But he is a successful rabbi in Portland. He's a major social activist, and he's an excellent speaker, very much in the tradition of oratory, and he becomes a very prominent Reform rabbi of the era. And in 1920, the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New York retires, and they're looking for a new rabbi. And Stephen Wise is recruited for the job, but Lewis Marshall is president of Temple Emmanuel at the time. And Stephen Wise says, I will become your rabbi if I have freedom of the pulpit. What does that mean, freedom of the pulpit? It's that he should be able to say what he believes on the pulpit without any sort of muzzle put on him by the board of trustees, and that he has full freedom to speak his mind from the pulpit, which is most American rabbis today, we assume that that's the case. You can say what you want. You have to deal with the consequences of what you say, but no one's going to say you forbid you from speaking certain things, But according to the history, Lewis Marshall and the board of Emmanuel refused to accept Weiss's condition. So he withdraws his name and he starts his own synagogue. Now, there is a theory that Stephen Wise engineered this whole affair to gain public attention, and he always intended to start his own synagogue. He never intended to become the rabbi of Emmanuel. He always intended to start his own synagogue, and he just wanted the extra publicity. Nobody knows if that's true or not. But in any case, he starts his own synagogue, and it's called the Free Synagogues. Now, it's called the Free Synagogue not because it's free to join. It's not free, but because it has freedom of the pulpit, that he has the right to speak his mind. And it's a very successful synagogue. They meet in Carnegie Hall. He has Sunday morning services in Carnegie Hall where he gives sermons and so forth. And they're the first synagogue to create an office of social services. So people could come there and they could get counseling. They could get help finding jobs. It was really kind of a lot of things that Jewish federations do today. He was trying to do through the synagogue, which was very forward-looking at the time. And in addition, what Stephen Wise perhaps is even more famous for is his political advocacy. So he was active in New York politics. He helped fight corruption. You know, Tammany Hall and the insiders that chose all the public officials in New York City, he helped fight that. He was initially an opponent of American involvement in World War I, although he changed his tune soon after America got in, like many people did. But he was a politically active force. And then during the initial years of Nazi Germany, he was one of the very first people to speak out against Hitler. In fact, he led a massive rally in 1933, I believe April or May of 1933, in Carnegie Hall. I think it was either Carnegie Hall or Madison Square Garden. It might have been Madison Square Garden. He led a massive rally against the rise of the Nazi Party. So he was truly, you know, he was challenging Nazi Germany before many people were. And he had a very strong relationship with Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sadly, this is a major criticism of Wise. His relationship with Roosevelt was so close that he didn't speak out enough against Roosevelt when Roosevelt wouldn't bomb the tracks. I mean, people knew what was happening in death camps in 1942, 1943. And Stephen Wise did not speak out then. He did not draw public attention to it because Roosevelt begged him not to. And he felt that he could be more of a positive force by staying in the president's good graces than of antagonizing the president and speaking out and saying, we have to do something about the Holocaust. So people are critical of Wise for that today, that he was in a way too close to Roosevelt. He wanted to protect his access to Roosevelt. Whether that's a fair criticism or not, I don't know. Who, you know, it's very hard to judge people. We have the hindsight of history, but we don't know, you know, what was going through his head at the time. But he certainly spoke out against Nazi Germany before many other people did. In addition to starting the synagogue, he also started a rabbinical school. Right today, Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, has campuses in New York and Los Angeles and Jerusalem. But until the 1950, I believe before 1950, there were separate seminaries. There was the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and there was the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. And the Jewish Institute of Religion is what was started by Stephen Wise. And it was different from the Hebrew Union College because it was a Zionist rabbinical school. It said, we believe that rabbis should support the establishment of the state of Israel. We believe that rabbis should travel to Israel. And at that time, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati was anti-Zionist. So Stephen Wise started this school to be a counterweight. And then when he died, that's when the schools merged. But he was he was a visionary. He was someone who was able to really get people inspired and involved in different causes. He was also very ahead of his time in interfaith relationships. He was close with many of the leading ministers in New York City. You know, the minister at Riverside Church, very famous church. He was a model of sort of a rabbi activist pre-World War II. You know, that at that time, rabbis were the public voice of the Jewish community. There weren't major, you know, the American Jewish Committee existed, but it wasn't, you know, again, it wasn't the kinds of organizations they are now. Stephen Wise was sort of this very central leader of American Jewry. Questions about him? Yeah, Sue.
Yeah, so you mentioned that he had Sunday morning services.
Yes.
And is he the one that started that? Because I remember, I know that I think KAM had Sunday morning services and Temple Sinai had Sunday morning services. And I know they've gotten away from that now because there was a lot of criticism that it was just imitating Christianity, which Jews were objecting to. But did he start that?
No, he didn't start it, but you're absolutely right. Many synagogues, especially prior to World War II, probably half of Reform synagogues had Sunday morning services. They probably started, it's unclear exactly when, but likely in the 1870s and 1880s. And they started essentially because there was a feeling that if you were a Jewish shopkeeper, you had to be open on Saturday or else you wouldn't be able to make a living. That was the big shopping day because everything was closed on Sundays. And Sundays was the day when Americans worshiped. And so the thinking was, well, we are American Jews and we can't observe the Sabbath as we're supposed to observe the Sabbath, or else we won't be able to make a living. But perhaps like Americans, we can pray on Sunday, but we'll just pray in our synagogue. And interestingly, most synagogues did not call it the Sunday Sabbath service. They didn't call it Sabbath. They just called it the Sunday service. So it was essentially a couple of prayers and a sermon. It wasn't really about the worship. It was about the sermon. Because remember, this is the day, there's no television. This was entertainment. This was where you went to be entertained, to learn something. And these speakers were great speakers. They were performers in many ways. And so many Reform synagogues had their primary worship Sunday morning. And that lasted, probably through even a little bit after World War II. Many synagogues in Chicago, in Cleveland, Temple Sholem had Sunday morning, KAM, Sinai. It started to fade away kind of when, Jews were not as much shopkeepers anymore. People, they're just, life changed and it wasn't as much an economic necessity. And Jews became more comfortable with their religion, and in being, and Friday night became the main service. But you're absolutely right. Many synagogues did. Yeah.
Because when I was growing up in a Reform temple on the north side, we used to call Temple Sholem the church on the lake.
Yeah, it's great. It was oftentimes the large, old, synagogues with the most assimilated populations that had Sunday morning services. The newer synagogue, and often ones that had German Jewish roots, right? That were started in the 1850s and 1860s. The temple in Cleveland is a great example of this. Even Temple Sinai kept up Sunday services the longest, really. I mean, they were still doing them in the 1980s. What happened essentially, though, is attendance faded. It used to be that there was nothing else to do on a Sunday morning, and that's what people did. The parents would go to services and the kids would go to Sunday school, and that was that. And that kind of faded away. But it was a major draw. In fact, Sinai famously would have guest speakers. They would have famous speakers come in on Sunday morning as well, and they would have famous politicians, thought leaders. I think Eleanor Roosevelt once spoke there. So it's a very interesting history. It's a very, you think about synagogues played an essential role in the process of American Jews kind of acculturating and becoming American. It was Sunday morning was a way of sort of asserting one's Americanness in many ways as well. Yeah. Other questions about Stephen Wise? Very interesting figure. Controversial. Okay. Let's see if I had it. Did I have anything more? Oh, yes. Okay, I talked a lot about this. He's into social action, Zionism. He was a complex figure. He was. There was a period of time when the Reconstructionist movement, which was started by Mordecai Kaplan, there was hope that the Reconstructionist movement could merge with the rabbinical school that Stephen Wise had founded to sort of create a whole new movement. But Stephen Wise was too assimilated for many of the Eastern European Jews who were starting to become part of the Reconstructionist movement. Even though Stephen Wise was very proud of his Jewish heritage, he was in some ways still too reform for the more ethnic Jews who were part of the Reconstructionist movement. This was a very complex time in American Jewish history. There were, people came from different backgrounds, and those backgrounds mattered. Kind of like in Chicago, there used to be the Covenant Club and the Standard Club. The Standard Club was the German Jews, and the Covenant Club was the Eastern European successful Jews. They were both successful. You had to be pretty well off to be part of it, but they had different backgrounds. A lot of that's faded away. Those differences don't matter much anymore. But during this period of time, they exerted themselves very strongly. Okay. Let's see if we can get one more. Okay, yes. Now, this is in contrast to Stephen Wise. I was talking a little bit about Cleveland. Abba Hillel Silver, very, very interesting figure. I conducted the funeral, and I was very close with, before he died, a man by the name of Judge Seymour Simon. He was a remarkable man. He was married by Abba Hillel Silver. He loved to tell me that. But so Abba Hillel Silver is born in Poland. He immigrates to the United States when he's 9 years old. Father, grandfather, Orthodox rabbis. Ultimately lives in the Lower East Side, but wants to become a rabbi, but decides he wants to become a Reform rabbi. He goes to University of Cincinnati, then Hebrew Union College, and then he serves briefly in Wheeling, West Virginia, which at that time was a fairly prominent Jewish community, and then goes to Cleveland. What's so interesting about Abba Hillel Silver is that he was an ardent Zionist. The speech before the UN in 1947 that led to the vote to support the establishment of a state of Israel, Abba Hillel Silver gave the speech to the United Nations. You can read it online. It's an incredible speech. So he was this incredibly visionary Zionist leader, but he was also a classical Reform Jew. Most classical Reform Jews were anti-Zionists, or at best non-Zionists, kind of like Lewis Marshall. But Abba Hillel Silver was a combination of this very classical Reform rabbi, gave sermons on Sunday morning, was addressed as Dr. Silver, not Rabbi Silver, and yet he was this ardent Zionist. And what would happen is during the 1940s, he would spend all week in New York working on Zionist causes, raising money, doing things with the Jewish National Fund and so forth. And then he would take the train back to Cleveland and give a sermon Sunday morning. But he was, in contrast to Stephen Wise, he did not care about upsetting politicians. He was an ardent, passionate Zionist. In fact, Harry Truman forbid Abba Hillel Silver from visiting the White House because in their first meeting in 1946, according to the reports, Silver smashed his hand down on the table in the Oval Office, on the desk in the Oval Office, and said, "You must send support to Israel." So he was not he was not somebody who was tactful with politicians. He was somebody who was absolutely spoke his mind, which was, I guess, an admirable quality. You think about it. He was somebody who was passionate about the state of Israel. He was also an incredible scholar. You know, I've read the speeches of Abba Hillel Silver and Stephen Wise. If you read Stephen Wise's speeches, they don't hold up very well. They're just kind of a lot of platitudes. And I think Stephen Wise was a wonderful speaker. You know, he had a great charisma, but the content wasn't that deep. If you read Abba Hillel Silver, the content is profound. He was brilliant. He wrote books about Moses. He wrote an Introduction to Judaism book. He was a true scholar. But what happened to Silver is that after World War II, and then ultimately after the establishment of the State of Israel, he was kind of not really part of the Zionist movement anymore. He sort of settled back in his pulpit and focused on leading his synagogue. And this moment in time when he played a critical role in the Zionist movement was kind of set behind him. But for that period of time, he was really one of the great leaders of American Jewry. And interestingly, he was president of the CCAR, that's the Reform Rabbinical Group, when the group decided to leave its anti-Zionism behind and become a pro-Zionist movement. He led that shift because he was so respected by his fellow rabbis. And then his son became a rabbi as well. His son, who was named Daniel Jeremy Silver, and he became the rabbi of the temple in Cleveland after his father. Daniel Jeremy Silver was a great scholar as well. He wrote several books. Sadly, he died of a brain tumor very early. One of our congregants, Todd Rosenberg, who moved here from Cleveland, his family was very friendly with Daniel Jeremy Silver's family in Cleveland. So there's a lot of great stories. But he was another tremendous rabbinical force. And these, you know, one of the broader themes that I hope we can get out of learning here is that American Jewry really begins to play a pivotal role in global Jewish history during World War II and then after World War II. Before World War II, the vast majority of Jews lived in Europe. But then, after the Holocaust, the European Jewish community is decimated. And so the largest American Jewish community, or the largest Jewish community in the world, is in America. So American Jewry has to play this new role on the world stage. And Abba Hillel Silver was part of expanding that role. And so were other figures. So were several of the people we're going to continue to look at in the weeks ahead. Any questions, thoughts, things on your mind? Well, I think this is a good place to stop. And so I will see everybody next week and talk to you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was really interesting.